Ernest Henry Edward Shaughnessy was born on April 30th, 1923, to William Joseph Shaughnessy and Eliza Jane Tracy, but his story begins many years before. His family tree has 6 main branches: the Tracys, the Forsyths, the Shufelds, the Gostics, the Shaughnesseys, and the O'Reillys, all of whom contributed to the man he would become. Ernie's great-great-grandparents, William and Eleanor Tracy, boarded a ship called the Esther in 1832 with 7 of their 10 children. They left behind 3 who died in infancy. How hard that must have been for them. They set out from their home in Shoreditch, St. Leonard's Parish, England, to sail to Canada to start a new life. It took them 13 weeks. After arriving in Montreal, they traveled by cart and French ponies, hacking their way through virgin forest to make their own path. They pitched tents when they reached their destination, which was just outside Claremont, and they began to clear the land to make their farm. They also helped to clear the land that would later become roads called concessions in their township. On the ship, the Esther, with the Tracys, there traveled another family, the Reverend Thomas Gostick and his wife Sarah Spearing Burton, with their 2 sons and 3 daughters, one of whom was Sarah Gostick. It pleases me to think that the Tracy's son, William Jr., met and fell in love with Sarah Gostick on that voyage. In any event, they settled on a bush lot backing onto the Tracy land, and although they were over 2 miles apart, William and Sarah eventually married. One of their sons was named Henry, and Henry Tracy married Nancy Forsyth, and they had a daughter, Eliza Jane Tracy, who married William Joseph Shaughnessy, and they became Ernie's parents. The Gostwick name began as Gostwick and is recorded as one of the oldest names in England, dating back to 1309, when Sir William Gostwick lived during the reign of Henry III. And then Hugo Gostwick lived during Edward I's reign, and Sir Roger Gostwick around 1300 in Richard II's reign. But of all, the most noted was Sir John Gostwick, who died in 1545. He led the Battle of Flodden Fields when England's army was under the Earl of Surrey. Sir John and his brother Edmund turned the battle that appeared to be a defeat into a rousing victory. It was during that battle that James IV of Scotland was killed. The Earl of Surrey introduced Sir John to the court of the king. Since 1807, there has always been a Gostick in the Methodist ministry, a record broken only by 2 other families. Our Reverend Thomas Gostick, Ernie's great-great-grandfather, worked hard administering to 3 different congregations every Sunday, either walking or on horseback. Eventually, he built his own church on the property he bought from the crown. He cleared the land and built a log cabin, which was replaced by a stone house, and then a brick home, which still stands today and was owned by a Gostick at the last telling. On March 27, 1859, the day before he died. At 70 years of age, he walked 4 miles to Claremont to preach as usual. Some of his speech is as follows. I have come to the margin of the stream that has no bridge, and before another annual meeting, I will have crossed over. I regard your visit, dear and honored brethren, as the visit of the shining ones in Pilgrim's Progress, to encourage me to go and to pass over. Fare thee well, dear brethren, forever. The Reverend's wife, Sarah, spent her life caring for the sick, and they thought of her as their medical advisor. Both the Reverend and his wife were loved by all who knew them. Ernie's 23rd great-grandfather, Osbert de Forsyth, was the last of his line. All others having been killed in the war that plagued France at the time. It was his decision to leave France with his father that probably saved our family from extinction. The two joined the entourage of Eleanor of Provence as she journeyed to England to marry Henry III. After arriving in Dover, they stayed a short time in England and then moved on to Scotland, the home of their forefathers. Osbert's son, Wilhelm, is recognized in Scottish history as the feudal lord of County Peebles, who signed the Ragman Roll of Scotland in 1296. This was done to prevent civil war, and right or wrong, it remains an historical document. Wilhelm's son, Robert I, and his son, Osbert II, partnered with Robert Bruce as he fought for the crown of Scotland against Edward in the Battle of Bannockburn. It was the most important battle in Scottish history. Edward had 100,000 men and 40,000 horsemen, 2 men for every Scotsman. In 1314, Osbert II, at the age of 20, pledged his loyalty to Robert Bruce and played a vital role in the Battle of Bannockburn. Robert Bruce became King of Scotland, and for his loyalty, Osbert was granted feudal lands in Stirlingshire. Osbert II's son, Robert II, was one of the greatest military leaders in Scotland. He became governor in Stirling Province. John, the son of Robert II, not only held the crown office in Stirling in 1379, but was also Baron of Dykes, and so the title passed on to their heirs for generations. Now we skip forward 17 generations to Gilbert Forsyth, who was born in 1650. He was a shoemaker and a farmer from the highlands of Scotland, and he emigrated to the United States somewhere before 1670. He lived in Boston, Massachusetts first, and then became one of the first settlers in Hartford, Connecticut. He had a daughter who died in her youth, and a son named James who moved to Groton. This son named his son James, and the James II named his son James. But James III went right outside the box, and he named his son Caleb. Caleb was born in Niagara Falls in 1658, and he emigrated to Ancaster, Ontario, Canada. But he reverted to type, and he called his son James. But this James He stuck to his guns, and he called his son Caleb. And this Caleb was born in December 16th, 1809, and he became Ernie's great-grandfather. On December 29th, 1828, he married Susan Shufeld, and their daughter, Nancy Forsyth, married Henry Tracy. And Henry's daughter, Eliza Jane, married William Joseph Shaughnessy, and they became Ernie's parents. I don't know too much about the Schufelds. I believe they came from Germany. There's a few things to note about the Forsyths. Every Forsyth today can be traced back to the original Osbert de Forsyth who left France. So we're all related, however many times removed. There was a Forsyth who was the gardener of Kensington and St. James Palaces, and he created a plant which they named the Forsythia, and it's still found growing in flower beds today. He was also the author of several books, one of them a bestseller, about caring for fruit trees. Another Forsyth developed the percussion cap, which replaced the flintlock. And Napoleon, he wanted it. So he offered them 20,000 pounds, but he was refused. However, the British Army used it without his knowledge, and the government eventually allocated him a modest pension. The first and last payment was received on the day he died. And finally, John Hubert Forsyth was third in command at the Alamo under William B. Travis and Jim Bowie. And since one of them was killed and the other gravely ill, it's likely that he was in charge at the time the Alamo fell. I wonder if Nancy Forsyth was even aware of the historical significance of her family. The Shaughnessy name began as O'Shaughnessy in Ireland. The O'Shaughnessys claim to be descended from the last pagan king of Ireland, who died in 428 AD. A variation of the name appears in 1159. In the 1200s, the clan settled in a fertile valley, and by the 16th century, that land was known as O'Shaughnessy country, and still is today. It lay in the counties of Clare and Galway, and includes the town of Gort. In the 1500s, rather than have their land confiscated, they were persuaded to surrender their lands to the British Crown, and then have it granted back to them under British law. In 1543, Dermot O'Shaughnessy went to London and was knighted by King Henry VIII, and was issued patents to the land he already held. They thought they would now be assured ownership to be passed on to their heirs. In 1660, Charles II became King of Ireland, and he began looking for ways to deprive them of their land by defective titles. The O'Shaughnessys refused to embrace the Church of England or to recognize the crown, and their lands were forfeited in 1697. 3 years later, the court ruled against them, but by this time, the clan was already leaving. Some went to counties Limerick or Cork, but here they had to pay rent to the English landlords, and the small tracts of land did not produce enough to feed their families and to pay rent too. The Catholics were not allowed to practice their religion, or to go to school. By 1830, the first signs of the potato crop failure had begun, and the Irish were dying by the thousands. Those who were able to left to start a new life in Canada, Australia, and the United States, where land was plentiful and there was freedom from religious persecution. They were starving and dressed in rags as they piled into the coffin ships that would take them to a new life. But the coffin ships were poorly built, and many simply came apart in the sea. And many of the Irish never made it to the land of their dreams. The name O'Shaughnessy shows up in civil and church records in 1830. Joseph was the first. Then William seems to have come in 1841, and finally Michael in 1845. All settled in the Barrie area. William Shaughnessy and Bridget McMahon are Ernest's great-grandparents. Their son Edward married Anne O'Reilly, and their son William Joseph married Eliza Jane, and they became Ernest's parents. Philip and Margaret O'Reilly is Ernest's great-grandparents. They seem to have emigrated to Canada between 1845, when Hugh was born in Cavan, Ireland, and 1847, when Margaret was born in Vesper Township. This was 5 or 6 years after William Shaughnessy arrived. They brought 3 children with them, and after Margaret, they had Anne O'Reilly in 1853. And Anne grew up to marry Edward Shaughnessy, and their son, William Joseph Shaughnessy, married Eliza Jane Tracy. And of course they had a son, Ernest Henry Edward Shaughnessy. Although we don't know for certain, I think we can assume they suffered the same hardships as the Shaughnessy's in starting a new life in Canada. When I think about those hardships they faced and overcame, I wonder how they did it. Was it too much to ask? A piece of land to raise their crops so they could feed their children. Freedom to practice the religion of their choice. An education for their kids. A new start in a new place. And the opportunity to make their own way in the world. We all want that. And because of them, our path is a lot easier. And thanks to them, we got to know and appreciate a wonderful man who had many friends who called him Shag.